Hi, I'm Kerstin Canby. I am the Senior Director of Forest Trends Forest Policy Trade and Finance Program. And I'm here today with Silas Siakor. He is a colleague of ours working in Liberia. He's been working on forest governance and helping to make sure that communities who live and depend on forests share in the benefits from these forests. Well, hello, Silas. Welcome. It's an honor to have you here. And I was actually just thinking about how we've actually known each other for many years. In fact, we've known each other for so long. It was before we could even connect like this, recording a virtual interview linking Forest Trends offices in Washington, me here in London, you in Liberia. So it's just a really pleasure to have been working with you for this long. Before we dive in, I'm going to say a few words about you and your history. So I was thinking how few can say that they helped topple a warlord in the midst of an armed conflict using forestry data. So you helped expose how Liberia's forests were being cut down and the revenues from those logs were funding the country's civil war in the 1990s and 2000s. And this work on conflict timber, it took courage and it helped lead to the UN sanctions, which stripped the armed groups of revenues that was helping to fund the armed conflict. And your story has inspired sort of generation of activists and policymakers, not only in Liberia, but around the world. And you were awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2006 for these efforts. So you are really, a dynamo, and you haven't stopped since. And today we want to look at how your courage has evolved into a vision for the future of Liberia's forests, one that puts communities and transparency of information at the center of the story. So to start, could you please introduce yourself, your name, your current role, and the work that's keeping you busy right now?
Thank you. My name is Silas Siakor. I currently work for a Liberian organization, the Integrated Development and Learning, IDL, and we are basically still working on the forestry issues. But it's almost 2 decades since I worked on logging, in particular looking at the timber trade during the civil crisis. And I have evolved over the last 20 years, and I'm focusing very much on working with policymakers, being at the table, having the presence and influencing a policy development and implementation.
Yeah, and you've been a very strong advocate for forest governance for communities in Liberia for those past 2 decades. And can you tell us, why is transparency and good data so critical when it comes to how forest lands are used and how their revenues are shared?
The reason why reliable, accurate, verifiable data is important, there are a couple of reasons. One, the rights holders, the communities themselves, and their allies get to communicate in terms of actual economic situations on the ground and how they are benefiting or not benefiting fairly from the timber trade, for example. You also have good data to be able to educate policymakers about the impact of the policies that have been developed. And those that are involved in law enforcement, you are able to present verifiable information about how well they are doing or how poorly they are doing, and using numbers to tell those stories. This can be a very complicated undertaking, and the more accurate the information you have, the stronger your advocacy, the more informed your advocacy, and the more likely you are likely to inform and win over policymakers, duty bearers, law enforcement officers to do the right thing, to advance the interests of communities in terms of their benefits, but also to advance the national interest, because the state is able to capture the revenue that is due in terms of taxes from logging companies, and they are also able to enforce the rules of the game because they have verifiable information about non-compliance, for example, on fiscal issues in the different agreements with the multinationals that operate.
Yeah, so the rules of the game in Liberia on paper appear to be quite good. Liberia's own forest laws have recognized for years that rural communities most affected by industrial logging or mining should share in the benefits. And that then, starting 3 years ago, and actually there were some reviews done before that, in 2023, Forest Trends worked with you and the government of Liberia to review many of the logging and mining concessions to see how well they complied with Liberia's own national laws and regulations. And what we found was serious gaps across these sectors. And that at least then, at more than US $20 million in land rental fees were still owed to communities according to Liberian's own law. So how did data and documentation help move this conversation forward in a constructive way?
Actually, this this situation underscores the value of accurate information, because with that concession review, the information was clear, verifiable, very strong base, and the companies that were at the center of all this could not dispute the numbers. The government, on the other hand, could not dispute the numbers because the data was actually coming from them, coming from the companies themselves. And because those numbers could not be disputed, what is all communities is no longer in dispute. So the government recognizes that it has a legal obligation to collect and transfer the community share of the revenue. The companies have accurate information about what exactly they owe these communities. Therefore, that conversation can no longer be sentimental. It is fact-based. The evidence is there. It is indisputable, and the obligations on both sides are very clear from the government, from the communities, and the communities have very strong basis to make the case, to demand that the government remit their share of the logging revenue. That would not have been possible if the data wasn't available to the communities, if the data wasn't available to NGOs working on these issues, if the data wasn't available to civil servants, to policymakers, to duty bearers, they would not be in a very strong position to engage with the conversation in a meaningful way. Oftentimes, without that information, it becomes sentimental, and then the reality of the situation gets diluted in all of the sentimental exchanges that tend to happen between the different actors.
Yeah. So you know the design of that report very well. In fact, you helped Forest Trends design that report and the investigation. But we did more than just provide data. Can you tell the audience why it was so important to see in this independent investigation, not just a call for reform, but also offered practical steps forward, basically a roadmap of how to get there?
With that report, the first thing, the first benefit was that the communities could engage with the Forestry Development Authority, with people at the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning, and say, this is what the government owes us. And the very first thing that happened was that during the budget making process, the national budget development process, there was a very focused conversation about how much of what the government owes these communities can we put into the budget so that we are able to make some payments to the communities. So it triggers immediate positive action on the part of the government to address the areas that are there. But more importantly, it also provides the communities a better understanding of the economics of the sector. So they can see very clearly how much the companies are generating from the resources that are being extracted from their area, how much of the value of that resource is actually being transferred to them for development, and how much of that revenue is being lost in between. And by doing that, the communities have a better understanding, about what options they would like to pursue going into the future, whether they want to continue with business as usual, relying solely on logging, or whether they want to explore other options of maximizing the economic benefits of the forest around them, of the natural resources they have.
So speaking of sort of economic value of the forest, some people, and not just in Liberia, see the extraction of natural resources, whether it's logging or mining, as either an environmental issue or an economic issue. But you've also framed it as a question of justice. So for the communities who've been waiting for years for these promised benefits, what would justice look like?
And justice in the eye of the local communities, these forest dependent communities, is kind of dressed in different forms. You talk about the environmental considerations that are there. And also there's the economic aspect of all of this. For these communities, they need the revenue to invest in local development priorities, whether in schools, in health, in education, in other welfare needs. That is one element of the needs that they have. On the other hand, they really would like for the extraction to happen, but to happen in the way that respects and protects their environment. So yes, they appreciate the revenue, but they are not always, they don't find it acceptable that the extraction of the resources is leaving a devastating environmental impact behind. So for them, justice is a combination of the two, ensuring that they get their fair share of the revenue that's generated, but also ensuring that the environmental impacts are kept to a minimum so that it does not degrade their resource base going into the medium or the long term, so that they are able to continue to survive and to thrive in their own territories, in their own locations.
Yeah, so let's talk about some other sources of income other than logging and mining. So for years, Liberia has been trying to generate conservation income through carbon markets, but it has not been so successful and not just a little bit controversial. You're working on a new initiative, the Payments for Stewardship Initiative, and it's offering a fresh idea: direct cash payments to communities that agree to keep their forests standing. What inspired this approach, and why do you think a non-market approach like this is more likely to succeed in Liberia's current governance and economic context?
Our concept for incentivizing local communities to embrace conservation is not new. The formulation, the thorough analysis that has long gone into that is perhaps the new element. But if I rewind the time as far back as 2009 and 2010, we were already asking the donor community. Liberia is emerging from civil war. There's a lot of demand for jobs to put ex-combatants to work, but also we need to be careful as to what type of jobs we create and how we invest in the natural resource sector so that we are assured of benefits now, but in the long run as well. So let's strike a balance. And one of the proposals we put on the table at the time was for donor partners, development agencies, to kind of provide the resources that Liberia needed to give us a breathing space, to take time to build the institutional arrangement that we needed, to put in place the systems of governance that we needed, to put in place the anti-corruption measures, good law enforcement elements, so that when we go into logging, we do so with a clear eye, and we are sure that we are going to maximize the benefits we get. That requires some revenue, some investment at the time. Unfortunately, that advice wasn't taken on board. The focus then was we needed to create jobs, by tapping on industries that were labor intensive, that required low skilled jobs, and therefore that could create immediate opportunities for ex-combatants to go out and work. So that argument won out. Fast forward 20 years later, we are now realizing that that was a mistake because we then paved the way for logging to start. And over the last 2 decades, logging has failed to deliver as per the expectations that we laid out for ourselves. Now we are coming back to a situation where we're asking ourselves, what then can we do? What other options are there? What other pathways are there? In the midst of all of this, since 2010, 2011, almost 20 years ago, we started having conversations in Liberia about reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, REDD plus, as it is called in most cycles. However, for those 2 decades, we've been working to achieve result-based payment, to be in a place where Liberia can receive some economic returns on all the efforts it is making to protect the forest. But because of the complexities of the regime that's being introduced, we haven't qualified after 20 years of laying the foundation. So we are now saying, we then went back and said, what other possibilities are there? And we said, what if we cut through all these complexities, find something very simple, basically use area-based payments, put some money on the table, and the communities that own the forest can decide how they want to invest that income, what their development priorities are, and as little as possible, remove the barriers before they are able to access that income. And therefore, we settle on 3 basic requirements, preconditions. The commitment that you will not engage in activities that drive deforestation, such as shifting cultivation in designated forest areas, mining in designated forest areas, establishing new settlements in designated forest areas, and finally, engaging in industrial or commercial timber extraction in those designated forest areas. If you can commit that you would not do that, that triggers the first year payment to the communities. So just making the commitment, just agreeing that you will restrict all of these activities that drive deforestation is good enough. And then when that agreement is signed and the initial payment is made, for us, the communities then realize that indeed this is not just another concept, but actually there is an economic value. And now they realize that compliance with those commitments will be the requirement they have to meet in order to trigger subsequent payments for subsequent years. So you begin to monitor their action. You are in a better place to see results because you are able to go on the ground and verify that those 4 activities are not happening. And the beauty of this scheme is that it does not rely on sophisticated carbon accounting. It's physical. You can see whether a new farm has been created or not. You can see whether the trees are still there compared to what happened when the commitments were made. You can see that there's no logging activities. You can see that there's no mining activities. You can verify very easily without waiting for sophisticated, high-tech interventions to be able to verify compliance. So in our view, that approach makes it possible for communities themselves to take ownership of the effort. It makes it possible for communities themselves to monitor and enforce their own rules on the ground. It encourages compliance rather than external enforcement. So taking all of that together, this really for us drives community interest, and we are beginning to see already some excitement in the communities where we are piloting this idea.
So you've touched on issues of complexity and accountability with some forms of climate finance. It's been sort of a challenge for lots of climate finance. In your model right now, it's starting with 125,000 acres, but there are desires, hopes that it will cover millions of acres in the future. So from your experience working with Forest Trends and many others, what does it take to scale a solution like this, but without losing its integrity or becoming so complex that it becomes a challenge?
So what we have done is to really lay all of this out in a roadmap. So basically being super clear about how we identify communities to participate, the different criteria we use to evaluate their readiness to participate, and what type of capacity development support we need to bring in to accompany the payments. The idea is that it is not just about delivering funding to these communities. It is also about working with them, accompanying them on their journey in order to comply with the commitments that they make. Therefore, that roadmap lays out a next step, which is extending to at least 500,000 acres by 2027 and looking beyond that as well. And the way we intend to approach this, the scale up, is where we are at the moment. We've started small, 125,000 acres. We have learned some things already in the very first year. For example, ensuring that the community level deliberations are happening and elites are not being allowed to take over those conversations, but that they are open and all the different perspectives are being brought to the table. So really accompanying the different communities that participate on this journey, building their capacity to manage their internal decision-making processes, making sure that whatever is done with a lot of integrity built into that, so that at the end of the day, there's a high level of accountability on all sides, both from the NGOs that are delivering, supporting these communities, but also for the communities in terms of their compliance with the commitments they make. And the government has a very limited role, and it is focused more on capacity development for the communities, so that it is not about criticizing the communities, it is about working with them and building the capacity at the local level for them to do what they have to do in order to benefit the human community, the forest as well, and the whole of the country. Moving on.
Well, you have definitely helped take Liberia's forests from being a source of conflict finance to a source of hope with this new initiative. When you look 5, 10 years down the road, what kind of legacy do you hope this work leaves, both for the world's forests, but also for the people who live and depend on them?
I think looking ahead, and just to kind of make the case that we try to communicate about this initiative as clearly as possible. And sometimes in trying to realize that clarity, we kind of tone down points around other aspects. So this is not solely about keeping trees standing. So as part of our agenda looking down the road is to work with these communities to also understand the biodiversity significance, importance of the forest that they are maintaining. So on the one hand, as a start, keep the trees standing. Next step, understand the biodiversity, importance of those areas, and take a holistic approach so that you are managing that forest in a way that you are also protecting the biodiversity. So looking down the road 5 years from now, we are expecting, we are hoping, our vision is communities that are participating in this scheme have better livelihoods compared to those that are not participating, both in terms of sustainable use of the forest resources they have around them. For example, it will no longer be about high volume extraction of timber for external market. It will be about using the timber resources they have for their internal, for local development. Remember, they need the timber themselves to refurbish their schools, to build benches for students. They needed to construct clinics to provide local health care. So they are going to take a bit more sustainable approach to using the resources around them. That's the kind of vision that we have set for ourselves. And at the same time, as they look more internally, as they consider more the biodiversity importance of these areas, they also will integrate proper management of other forest resources, the wildlife, for example, into the overall arrangement of how they manage their forest as a basket of goods and not just for one item, the trees.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up now, but your work reminds us that good data, transparency, brave leadership, strong partnerships with communities, with government, with NGOs can help change the course of a country. So thank you for sharing your vision with what comes next and for showing us what's possible when communities are at the heart of forest protection.
Thank you, and I appreciate being a part of this effort to bring this out there. I really appreciate it. Thank you.